Okay, in this quick tutorial, well, it may be a quick tutorial. I don't really know how long it's going to take. In this tutorial, what we're going to talk about is sprites. Sprites are a method of importing images into the Voyager landscape in such a way that you can make things like people or trees or cars, things that you might want to place in the environment, look like they belong in the environment. Now, normally when we think about a sprite in context of something like Voyager, we think about an image that has an alpha channel, and an alpha channel is basically a channel in an image which is transparent. So if we wanted to, for instance, put a person inside a landscape, we would get a picture of an image of a person, but we'd have to create an alpha channel in order to get rid of everything that was not the person. I'll show you what I mean by that. So I've got a simple landscape here that I've prepared. Now what we're going to do is just bring up the Sprite menu. We do that by typing the X key, or we can also bring it up by clicking on the Sprite Manager, which is the icon for the Sprite Manager, which is there. And we're going to open a sprite, or I'm going to open an image first of all. And this is a sprite with no transparency channel, because I just want to show you what we mean when we talk about having an alpha channel or a transparency channel. So I brought in a sprite, and Voyager has put this sprite right in the middle of my point of view, which is where it always will do that, if it can do that. And you can see straight away that there's a problem. I mean, this is an image of a person, but there's a kind of a square around them, so it looks like a picture being stuck in the landscape. And obviously, if we wanted it to look like a person, we need to actually get rid of that that kind of white square that's around the person. Now, you can prepare your own sprites quite easily in an application like Photoshop or Affinity Photo. One of those kinds of image editing apps will actually allow you to create an alpha channel. And Voyager comes with a whole selection of people which are already pre-prepared as sprites with alpha channels. And so we have this young woman as a sprite with an alpha channel. So we'll just get rid of that particular one that I brought in by clicking the little icon at the top there. And now I'm going to open the actual sprite, which is in the people selection inside the Voyager application folder. And you'll see straight away now we have exactly the same thing, but the alpha channel just means that now we don't see anything of that square around the person, and we have a person who we can stick in our landscape. Now sprites are really useful for bringing things into Voyager that are very complicated, things like people or trees, things that you might want to put in your landscape. Anything really can be a sprite. As I said, we've popped this sprite in the middle here. It will appear there, and it's right in front of the camera. So if we look just here, you can see our camera point of view, and the little X denotes where the sprite is going to be placed. Now, the default height for sprites is always 1.9 meters, which is just a kind of a convenience really, because it's about the height of a person. So if you bring in a person, one of the images of a person inside of the examples folder, the library, you'll actually have something that's around the size of the person. Now, the first thing to note is that this is always put at the same distance from the camera, but that might not necessarily correspond with the landscape that you're on here. And I can tell straight away that this sprite is actually sitting very close to the camera. And if we were to put it right over here by clicking, we kind of lose it. One thing that I should also mention is that you can put the sprite at whatever terrain level you happen to place it on by clicking here, and it will actually put it on the terrain level. You can't see it because it's actually really tiny. Well, in fact, it's 1.9 meters high, but it's a very long way away. So it's actually there, and it's sitting right on the landscape, but it's very small. And that would be correct if I was close enough to it. We would actually be able to see it at the correct scale. But what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to make it bigger so we can actually see it. So what I've done there is I've just made the sprite height bigger. So really that's a 30-meter high person now. And by clicking here, it'll put it on the ground level. Obviously, if we were trying to keep to the Voyager scale, we wouldn't do something like that. Let's just try that, because I'll put it back at 1.9 meters. I haven't actually done this, so I'm kind of just doing it on spec. And so it's actually sitting in the same place here. So what I'm going to do is move the camera in a little bit and see if we can, let's do it from this menu. It might be a little easier to do it here. Yeah, we can see our person there. She's just there. But she's quite small. Oh, where's she gone? Yep. Just there. So I'm going to keep on going in. I'm basically just trying to show you here how it's the right scale, and I just made it bigger because I could. But if you wanted to keep things in scale, this is of course the way that you must do it. So we're going right in here, and we're actually finding that we're now close to the Voyager surface, and our figure is in fact at the right scale for this kind of terrain. Or did I go too far? No, there she is. Okay. So there is our figure sitting on the terrain in the right scale. That's exactly the right scale for the Voyager landscape if we so wanted to do that. One thing that you will notice, and so you would want to do that with people. So for instance, if you're in any of the Utopia files, and Utopia, which is the kind of futuristic city that comes with Voyager, you probably want to keep your people at the right scale, because then they're in the right scale for the city. Sometimes when you're working in a landscape, as in this case, it doesn't work so well, because coming very close into many of the Voyager landscapes, you start to get the wrong kind of detail. There are ways of getting correct detail on these landscapes, but you need to kind of know a little bit about how they work to do that. But in this particular case here, we have our figure, and she's pretty much exactly the right scale for this landscape. One thing that you will have noticed here is that she's got a shadow, and this is one of the great things about sprites, is that they are fully interactive with the Voyager landscape. So they'll cast shadows, and they'll also make reflections. So here you can see she's got a shadow, and it's correct to the landscape. It looks exactly right. Of course, one of the things is that moving the sun around is not actually really influencing the lighting on the character itself, and that's one of the drawbacks of using sprites, in as much as you don't have any way of correctly lighting the sprite. And to show you that, I'll show you what I mean by putting in a different kind of sprite. So let's just go back here and see our figure. She's so small that we can't even see her. We'll go back into the Sprite Manager, and I'm going to take away her sprite. I'm just going to add another sprite. I have a tree here. So this is a tree that I've created in another application, and it's got some lighting on it. Once again, this comes in at 1.9 meters, as you can see here. That's incorrect for a tree, of course. We want our tree to be something in the order of 40 meters high, maybe. And there it is, but it's way close to us now. So let's just move around a bit. We'll actually zoom out a bit here, and we'll put our tree a bit further away. Where's that nice piece of green? Okay, we'll stick it on that piece of green over there, and we'll hit it to the ground. So it is actually now resting on the ground over there. Straight away, you'll see that something kind of looks pretty odd about it, and that is that the light is coming from behind, and yet the tree is actually illuminated from the right-hand side. And that's the key to making sprites work in your environment. You've got to match the lighting. Now, if you are able to do this in another application, if you wanted to create your tree in another modeling application, you can actually change the light there, and you can decide what your Voyager environment is going to be like, and then change the lighting on your tree to adapt to that. Or the other way of doing it is, if you don't have that option, of course, you can change the lighting in Voyager to match what you have here. And so we would need to move our sun around on the other side to make it feel more like it was, you know, this tree was actually part of this environment. It's still not quite right there. You can see which way the shadow goes. So the light is coming from this side of the tree, and we obviously need the shadow to be on the other side of the tree. And then it will be, you know, correct for the environment that we're in. And that looks better. I mean, you know, this is just very quick and quite ad hoc, so it's not absolutely perfect, but you can see that with a little bit of judicious tooling around here, you'd be able to get it to match very, very well. Let's just move the tree closer, just so we can. One other thing you can do, obviously, is kind of bring the tree in and have it sort of set off in the foreground like this. Move our sun. Let's make our sun a little more orange, so it looks a bit more sunsetty. Push it a bit further than that, I think. And our tree a bit closer. And you can kind of see that this is sort of matching now. This sort of looks like it all belongs in one picture. If I move the sun onto the other side again, now it sort of looks weird because the sun's actually coming from one angle on the tree and a different angle on the landscape. So that's a kind of a thing to keep in mind when you're putting sprites into your landscape, that you need to be able to match the lighting in some way or other to make it work for you. The sprites themselves, you can change aspects of the way they look. They have the same kinds of controls as DF objects and the landscape has. You can add specular characteristics to them. Most of the time you won't want to do that though, so you can actually take most of this off to 0 because specularity on a flat object usually doesn't really work that well. Got to remember that this object is flat. It's actually a flat object, doesn't have any dimension. So if you add specularity to it, you'll get a reflection that makes it look like it's a photograph or a piece of cardboard or something. So often that's not really what you want. One of the key things that you will want to do though is have the correct self-illumination level, because often a sprite needs its own illumination to look correct in the environment. It may not match exactly the illumination that's in the rest of the environment. The ambient level you can usually have fairly low, because the ambience of the sprite is really not something you want to be controlled by the Voyager atmosphere. But that, again, you know, sometimes that's not true. Another thing I should mention about sprites too is that depending on where you place them in the landscape, the haze and the ambience of the landscape will actually affect them. So you can have, if we place these trees, where this is at the moment, it's quite close to camera. You can kind of see that it's quite crisp and clear, and it probably should be if it's close to camera. But if it's further away, it should look more misty. So let's try and put it way back here. This little hand here moves the landscape around. I'm going to try and put it up on this hill somewhere. I have to put it up there. It's possibly not as misty as it could be, and we can fix that by just adding a little bit more of the ambient level in there. And it will start to look like it's distant, you know, like it's away in the distance. And that's one of the really terrific things about being able to put a sprite in your Voyager landscape and not just sticking it in a post app, because you know, if you put it in at a later stage, you have to match all these characteristics in that app. Whereas if you put it in inside of Voyager, then the Voyager environment will actually do a lot of that work for you. It'll put in the shadows, it'll put in the haze, it'll put in all of that kind of stuff, and that's of course, you know, really what you want to achieve. Also, the other thing too that I should show you is reflections, because sprites also react to reflections, and that's another thing that's very difficult to do if you're putting it in in an exterior app after the event. So let's put our sprite here. So I've changed the location, which means the sprite is now elsewhere. But if we go back into the sprite menu here, we can just put the sprite back in front of the camera by clicking there. Once again, it's very close. And we've lost where our camera is, so we can bring the camera right into the center by doing that. So now we're seeing where our camera is, where our sprite is, and we can see we're right on the water here. So let's just zoom out a little bit. Okay, and we'll move our sprite a little bit further away over here. Now it's sunken in the water, of course, because that's where it is. We can change the sprite's height at any time by making sure our mode over here is in sprites, and at this stage we have it at about 8.9 meters, but we can just type in anything there and have the sprite move in its height, of course. Let's move it a little bit further away still. Okay. We have a tree in the water, and you can see it's being completely and utterly accurately reflected in the water. If we move the roughness of the water up a bit, that will actually affect the way the tree looks as well. Let's move it right up there. And so you can see you can get quite a high level of realism as long as you are careful enough to match the direction of the sun and the kinds of lighting and so forth with the ambient level and the self-illumination level. You can create silhouettes with things as well. That's another thing you can do. If you put your self-illumination and ambient right down and put the ambience here right down, you can get silhouettes. So it's very useful for doing things like making silhouettes against a sunset and so forth. So quite a lot of variability when you're doing sprites. You can also set reflection color and level here, so the actual sprite can be reflective. You probably don't want a reflective tree that's just kind of reflecting the environment around it, but maybe if you're wanting to do something quite surreal, you could do that. But it's useful for other things, because you can also have sprites that are not vertical but horizontal. By clicking this, it'll make the sprite horizontal. And what that means is that you can actually use the sprite as a layer. So if you wanted to make something like a carpet, I saw Steve Swain did a really interesting thing where he made a pattern that was underneath the water, and you could probably use that to make a pattern in a swimming pool underneath the water or something like that. And you can also use it as a surface, so you could make that reflective, and it could be a lake surface or something like that if you wish to do that as well. When we're in vertical, I should also explain, you have the option of having the sprite always face your eye or not, which means that you can actually rotate it. Now, a lot of the time you won't want to do that, but there are certain circumstances where that might be a desirable thing to be able to do. Mostly you always want the sprite to be fully face onto you so you have no distortion, because you can see it's flat. It's actually a flat thing. And so if you turn it around, it becomes pretty obvious that that's what it is. So most of the time, you'll always want this to be on always face eye. That's your kind of. Why did it not do that? Come on. Let's just don't need to redo it. Always face eye. Let's put our sprite level back down to 50, and we'll stick the self-illumination back up a bit as well. So that's using an image as a sprite. So an image with an alpha channel, which can be brought in as a sprite. You can also control the shadows, of course, over here, how soft the shadows it casts are. You can, if you've got this checkbox checked here, auto land just means that whenever you bring a sprite in, it will automatically land it on the terrain. Probably not desirable to do that a lot of the time, because what you may find is if your camera is up at 100 meters or something and you click on that, it'll auto land the sprite, and if your sprite's only 1.9 meters high, you can immediately see that it will land it on the map, and your camera will be way above it, and you'll be going, where the hell is my sprite? It's just disappeared. So I find that it's just best not to have that clicked unless you really want it to do that every time you move it. It's really best to have the sprite right in front of you so that you can actually tell where it is, and then you can place it wherever you want it at some later date. So I think I've covered most of what's in there. And did I mention this? This just allows you to move your where you are around. That's quite useful, and a zoom in and out also. This little X box, as we saw, gets rid of the sprite. So one other aspect that I wanted to talk about is a different kind of sprite, and this is an ArtMatic file being used as a sprite. Now you bring it in exactly the same way as you'd bring in a conventional transparency sprite, but instead of being a sprite, as you can see here, it's an ArtMatic system. So we open it up, and I have this object that I've prepared before. Let's just make it a bit higher. So make it about 12. You can see this is kind of a strange object, and this sprite is defined in Designer as an object with an alpha channel. Let's have a look at it. Let's switch across. Where is it? Recent sprite. So you can see it looks exactly as we've seen before with things with alpha channels. It's got the checkbox behind it, and it's just something that I've made. Basically, it's got the alpha channel. It's got a bit of a mirror thing going on there, and that system itself can come directly in to Designer, into Voyager, sorry, and it will behave exactly the same way as any other sprite would behave. You can change the illumination, the ambient level, you can rotate it and so forth. Once again, it is a flat thing, so it's not a 3D thing, it's just flat, and it's just something that's being created as a 2D object inside of Designer. One thing I should point out to you, if you intend to make these kinds of things, I'll show you in fact. So let's just get rid of that. Go away. Okay, thank you. We'll go back to Designer here. What I'm going to show you here is this is actually a complete 2D system. So there are only two inputs coming into this system, and it's Voyager. When Voyager is actually looking for a sprite, it will only recognize a 2D system. So if you happen to have this set up so that you've got 3 ins and 3 outs at the top of it, I'll save it, and now I'll try and bring our sprite in. I'll show you what happens. So that's been resaved. I get an error message that says it needs to be 2D because what happens is that the ArtMatic file, because it's got a 3 input thing, is recognized by Voyager as a 3D file, and it doesn't want that. It wants a 2D file for a sprite. So let's just go back and let's go open again. I just made that 2D, by the way, if you didn't see that. Just changed its input, and now it will come in fine. So you can prepare a sprite in ArtMatic in ArtMatic Designer in that way. So obviously you can also do that with a picture from inside of Designer. So if you wanted to, you could actually bring your sprites in as images that you've pre-prepared in Designer. There are certain reasons you might want to do that. And in fact, that was the old way that we used to do sprites before the Sprite Manager, which is in CTX. You had to bring them in as an ArtMatic system. I think that's just about all I wanted to talk about with sprites. So I hope that was of some interest, and good luck hunting out some good sprites. You can generally find images with transparency channels quite easily. So if you do a little bit of a hunt around, you can find lots and lots of images that have transparency channels. And also, if you do happen to own applications that create 3D models, most of them will actually create a 3D model and render it out to a 2D image with an alpha channel. So it's quite possible that if you have something like Blender or you have DAZ Studio, you can make people or objects and you can render them with a transparency channel and then put them in your Voyager scenes. Okay, so enjoy. I hope that was of some use.